The dark reason German civilians were forced to bury the dead is not a story often told. Yet it is a chapter of World War II that exposes the unimaginable horrors endured by ordinary people as the Third Reich collapsed. As the war drew to its catastrophic close, the streets of German cities became unrecognizable landscapes of ruin, strewn with the bodies of soldiers and civilians alike. Amidst the rubble, the living were confronted daily with the presence of death, its stench, its weight, and its relentless accumulation. Yet the Nazi regime, even in its final throes, demanded order and obedience, compelling civilians to perform the grim labor of burial. This directive was not merely bureaucratic. It was a mechanism of control, a way to maintain a semblance of societal structure as the world disintegrated around them. Men, women, and even children were thrust into roles for which there could be no preparation, digging graves in streets flattened by bombs, removing corpses from collapsed buildings, and disposing of the dead in mass graves, often under the threat of punishment. Fear, grief, and moral conflict intertwined as civilians navigated the thin line between survival and complicity. The story of these civilians is a tale of endurance against both the physical devastation of war and the psychological torment imposed by authoritarian command. It challenges us to consider how ordinary people respond when confronted with extraordinary evil and unimaginable suffering. This narrative will explore the historical events, the social dynamics, and the profound psychological impact of being forced to bury the dead in the ruins of a nation, illuminating a dark and often overlooked facet of World War II. The dark reason German civilians were forced to bury the dead is a journey into the shadowed corners of history, revealing the human cost of obedience and the resilience of the human spirit amidst devastation. By late 1944, Germany was no longer the formidable war machine that had conquered much of Europe in the early years of the conflict. The tide of the war had shifted decisively. The relentless advance of Allied forces on both eastern and western fronts, combined with the devastating strategic bombing campaigns, had left the country fractured, both physically and psychologically. Cities that had once stood as symbols of German pride, Dresden, Hamburg, Berlin, Cologne, and countless others, now lay in ruins, their streets choked with rubble, their skylines pierced with skeletal remains of bombed-out buildings. The destruction was not merely architectural. It was an assault on the very fabric of civilian life. From the air, Allied bombers unleashed waves of explosives, firebombs, and incendiary devices, reducing dense urban centers to smoldering ashes. Night after night, German civilians endured terrifying raids, huddling in makeshift shelters, subways, or cellars as entire neighborhoods were consumed by firestorms. These campaigns were meticulously planned to cripple Germany's industrial capacity, disrupt supply chains, and, perhaps most cruelly, demoralize the population. In Hamburg alone, the firebombing of July 1943 had created a hurricane of flames, obliterating 10 square miles of the city, killing an estimated 42,000 civilians, and leaving hundreds of thousands homeless. By 1944 and 1945, the pattern of devastation had spread to nearly every major city. The air raids, combined with dwindling resources and overextended civil services, created an environment where death became an unrelenting, unavoidable presence. The collapse of infrastructure compounded the catastrophe. Railways, roads, bridges, and utilities, once the lifelines of urban life, were destroyed or rendered unreliable. Food and fuel shortages were widespread. Civilians, already traumatized by the violence of bombing raids, found themselves facing the slow attrition of starvation and exposure. Water systems failed under bombardment, sanitation collapsed, and disease threatened to compound the mounting toll of death. Hospitals, stretched beyond capacity and frequently damaged by airstrikes, could no longer cope with the sheer number of casualties, both military and civilian. Those who survived air raids were often left wandering through cities that had become labyrinths of debris and death. Displacement became a grim reality for millions. Families fled from city to city, or from rural areas to bomb shelters and makeshift camps, carrying with them the memories of destroyed homes and lost relatives. Entire communities fractured under the weight of constant evacuation orders, shortages, and the unrelenting approach of Allied troops. Children, elderly individuals, and the infirm often struggled to keep pace, relying on the charity of neighbors or sheer force of will. German civilians were caught in a liminal space between survival and annihilation, where every movement was fraught with danger, and every decision carried profound consequences. The approach of the Soviet Army in the east intensified the atmosphere of terror. The Red Army's advance was relentless, and news of atrocities committed during their occupation of Poland and Eastern Europe spread quickly through German territories. Civilians feared both the imminent arrival of enemy forces and the collapse of the regime that had promised them protection. Many towns on the Eastern Front were abandoned in haste, leaving behind streets littered with possessions, corpses, and the lingering traces of panic. Families who had remained as long as possible were suddenly forced into hurried evacuations, witnessing firsthand the fragility of life under total war conditions. Amid this destruction, German authorities attempted to maintain a semblance of order. Civil defense organizations and local Nazi officials sought to direct efforts in firefighting, rescue operations, and clearing debris, but these systems were overwhelmed. The administrative structures that had once efficiently mobilized resources now buckled under the sheer scale of devastation. Military priorities took precedence over civilian welfare, and civilians increasingly found themselves managing the consequences of the war with little support. The lines between military and civilian responsibilities blurred, as ordinary citizens were drawn into efforts to sustain the city's functions or recover the dead. The human cost of these years is staggering. Estimates suggest that by early 1945, tens of thousands of German civilians were killed outright by bombings, with countless more wounded or left to suffer from exposure, malnutrition, and disease. Those who survived carried not only physical scars, but also profound psychological trauma. The sight of neighbors, friends, and family members falling victim to bombs, bullets, or starvation became a daily reality. The streets of cities, once alive with commerce, culture, and social life, were now filled with corpses, debris, and the echo of sirens. Amid the chaos, civilians faced a new, horrifying expectation: to confront death not only as witnesses but as participants, charged with removing and burying the dead under the supervision of the collapsing Nazi state. It is crucial to understand that these conditions did not emerge overnight. The German home front had endured years of strain, rationing, and propaganda designed to maintain morale despite mounting losses abroad. By 1944, however, this carefully constructed illusion of control had shattered. Citizens who had once been insulated from direct combat now faced constant bombardment and the visible consequences of total war. Infrastructure that had supported life, transportation, electricity, water, hospitals, had failed, leaving civilians to navigate a landscape in which survival required extraordinary adaptability. Communities that had once relied on neighbors and local authorities for security now found themselves on their own, improvising to meet basic needs and responding to unprecedented emergencies. The convergence of these factors, continuous bombing, collapsing infrastructure, mass displacement, and the approach of invading armies, created an environment in which death was both omnipresent and unmanageable. Streets and buildings became mass graveyards, and the pace at which casualties accumulated far outstripped the capacity of emergency services. The reality for civilians was grim. Bodies could not simply be left where they fell, yet the resources, manpower, and organizational structures necessary for systematic burial had been destroyed or redirected toward the war effort. In this context, Nazi authorities increasingly relied on the coerced labor of ordinary civilians, compelling them to perform the grim, relentless task of clearing and burying the dead, a labor that would mark the final months of the war with indelible trauma. As Germany teetered on the brink of total collapse, ordinary citizens were forced into unimaginable roles. The environment of destruction, fear, and scarcity created the conditions in which the regime's directives, to dig, remove, and bury the dead, became a brutal reality for civilians. This was not a question of choice but of survival and coercion, a historical moment where the breakdown of state, society, and morality intersected in the most horrifying ways. It is within this context, the ruined cities, the dislocated populations, the relentless presence of death, that the story of forced civilian burials unfolds, revealing the dark and complex intersection of war, authority, and human endurance. The physical devastation of Germany in the final months of the war cannot be fully understood without examining the ideological framework that shaped civilian behavior. By 1944 to 1945, ordinary Germans were confronted not only with the destruction of their cities and the collapse of infrastructure, but also with the psychological machinery of the Nazi state, which had for over a decade cultivated loyalty, obedience, and fear. The regime's ideological grip extended deep into private life, shaping the ways people thought, felt, and acted, even in moments when survival itself seemed paramount. To understand why civilians could be compelled to undertake the horrifying task of burying the dead, it is essential to recognize how the intertwining of propaganda, fear, and moral coercion created an environment in which compliance often felt unavoidable. Propaganda had been a constant force in German life since the rise of the Nazi Party in 1933. Joseph Goebbels, the Reich Minister of Propaganda, understood the power of repetition, symbolism, and emotional manipulation. The regime's messages framed the war as a struggle not only for the survival of the nation, but for the preservation of an idealized German culture and racial purity. From schoolbooks to newspapers, radio broadcasts to public rallies, civilians were continuously exposed to imagery and rhetoric that emphasized duty, sacrifice, and the righteousness of the Nazi cause. By the time the Allied bombings intensified, these messages had long conditioned the populace to accept extraordinary demands from the state, including the prioritization of national or racial imperatives over personal safety or ethical hesitation. Fear functioned as an equally potent instrument of control. The Gestapo, the regime's secret police, maintained an omnipresent but largely invisible surveillance network. Reports of neighbors denouncing neighbors, friends informing on each other, or random arrests instilled pervasive anxiety. Civilian life became a tense exercise in vigilance and self-preservation, with the knowledge that dissent, hesitation, or even failure to comply with state orders could result in imprisonment, deportation, or death. In this climate, the coercion to participate in horrific acts, such as the burial of dead civilians and soldiers in bombed-out cities, was not merely a matter of obedience. It was also a practical necessity to avoid punishment. Compliance was a survival strategy, even as it forced ordinary people into morally compromising positions. The Nazis also employed a subtle but powerful manipulation of morality and guilt. Civic responsibility was reframed as obedience to the state, while personal judgment was undermined by constant reinforcement of the collective mission. Adults and children alike were indoctrinated to see themselves as components of a larger national organism, whose health depended on the fulfillment of assigned duties. For many civilians, this psychological conditioning produced a sense of inevitability. When orders were given to remove corpses, to dig graves, or to clear debris, the act itself was abstracted from morality and reframed as part of a larger, almost sacred, societal obligation. In the context of destroyed cities, where the sheer scale of death overwhelmed private ethical considerations, this reframing proved both persuasive and coercive. Ordinary Germans were also subjected to the manipulation of fear through selective exposure to the war's horrors. Nazi propaganda often emphasized the dangers posed by enemies, whether the Soviets in the East or Allied forces in the West, while suppressing inconvenient truths about German casualties and suffering. Civilians were taught to perceive danger as immediate and existential, to see the survival of the nation as paramount, and to accept that extraordinary measures might be necessary to preserve life. When confronted with mass death in bombed-out streets, the ideological training they had absorbed allowed them to rationalize acts that, under ordinary circumstances, would have been unthinkable. Burial labor became, in their minds, both a duty and a shield against personal culpability or external punishment. Yet it was not only fear and indoctrination that ensured civilian compliance. Social pressure played a significant role. In small communities and urban neighborhoods alike, conformity was enforced through observation and subtle peer monitoring. Individuals who hesitated or refused to follow orders risked not only state reprisal but social isolation. The collective experience of fear, trauma, and scarcity created an environment in which dissent was not only dangerous but also psychologically destabilizing. People sought reassurance in the actions of neighbors and acquaintances, and when these neighbors undertook gruesome tasks without protest, it became increasingly difficult to resist. Civilians were, in effect, caught in a cycle of compliance reinforced by ideology, fear, and social observation, a mechanism that ensured even morally conflicted individuals would participate in acts they might otherwise have rejected. The manipulation of language and perception further facilitated civilian complicity. The Nazis frequently employed euphemisms and bureaucratic terminology to obscure the reality of death and suffering. Terms like removal of casualties or clearing operations sanitized the brutal work of handling corpses, transforming it into a technical duty rather than a moral transgression. By framing burial labor as an administrative or civil responsibility, the regime reduced the psychological barrier to participation. Ordinary civilians, already exhausted by continuous trauma, could engage in these acts under the guise of efficiency, necessity, and public service. This subtle linguistic manipulation demonstrates the extent to which the Nazis engineered both the environment and the perception of moral obligation to ensure compliance. The intersection of ideology and coercion reached its apex in the final months of the war. With the Reich's defeat imminent, propaganda increasingly emphasized heroism, endurance, and sacrifice, while simultaneously painting any hesitation as betrayal. Civilians, facing the wreckage of their cities and the relentless approach of enemy forces, encountered a stark binary: comply with orders or risk punishment, abandonment, or social condemnation. The task of burying the dead, once an unimaginable burden, became an enforced expression of obedience. The coercion was psychological as much as practical. Civilians were conditioned to see themselves as agents of order in a world defined by chaos, to perceive compliance as moral and defiance as catastrophic. Despite this, resistance, both subtle and overt, was not entirely absent. Diaries, letters, and post-war testimonies reveal civilians grappling with ethical conflict, questioning the orders, and experiencing profound psychological distress. Some attempted to perform the work with as much care or dignity as circumstances allowed, while others reported feelings of guilt, shame, and lasting trauma. These accounts underscore the tension between ideological conditioning and innate moral reasoning, highlighting the extraordinary pressures imposed on ordinary people. The forced burial of the dead was not merely a task. It was a psychological crucible, exposing the fragility of human ethics under extreme duress. Understanding civilian complicity in these final months of the war requires a holistic perspective, one that considers the cumulative effects of propaganda, fear, social pressure, and moral manipulation. Ordinary Germans were not inherently cruel or indifferent. They were shaped by a regime that exploited vulnerability, exhaustion, and psychological conditioning to elicit obedience. The result was a population simultaneously victimized and implicated, navigating an impossible moral landscape in which survival, duty, and coercion intersected with devastating consequence. In this context, the acts of burial, the clearing of corpses, and the maintenance of some semblance of order were not merely logistical necessities. They were manifestations of a deeply ingrained ideology that intertwined obedience, fear, and the normalization of extreme acts. The narrative of forced civilian burials cannot be disentangled from the broader framework of Nazi control over everyday life, which leveraged both coercion and persuasion to compel participation. Civilians, confronted with destruction, starvation, and unrelenting terror, were manipulated into becoming instruments of a regime that demanded their moral compromise alongside their labor. The dark convergence of ideology and coercion ultimately set the stage for one of the most harrowing aspects of Germany's collapse: the transformation of ordinary citizens into reluctant agents of death management. The stage was now set for the grim reality explored in the next sections. How civilians, conditioned by decades of propaganda and sustained by fear, were forced to confront the dead of their cities directly, engaging in labor that would leave indelible marks on both the urban landscape and the human psyche. The ideological machinery that had dominated German life ensured that when orders came, no one could claim innocence through ignorance or hesitation alone. Complicity and coercion became inseparable, creating a moral and practical landscape in which survival and obedience were tightly bound, and the task of burial became a testament to the destructive power of ideology and fear. By the winter of 1944, the physical and psychological pressures on German civilians had reached unimaginable heights. The destruction wrought by relentless Allied air raids, coupled with the chaotic retreat of German forces on both eastern and western fronts, left cities in ruins and streets littered with the dead. The concept of mass death was no longer abstract. It had become an immediate and unavoidable reality. Corpses filled bombed-out homes, streets, and subway tunnels. Entire families perished beneath collapsing buildings. The scale of human loss was staggering, and yet, the mechanisms of official response had all but disintegrated. Fire brigades, emergency medical services, and municipal workers were overwhelmed, injured, or entirely unavailable, leaving ordinary civilians to confront the consequences of mass death directly. The nature of these deaths varied, but was uniformly horrific. Air raids reduced apartment blocks, schools, hospitals, and churches to smoldering ruins. Incendiary bombs created firestorms that consumed whole neighborhoods within hours, killing indiscriminately. Street executions, particularly in regions experiencing partisan activity or suspected resistance, added another layer of terror, leaving bodies exposed and unclaimed. Even those who survived the initial bombardments often succumbed to secondary causes: exposure, starvation, or injuries untreated due to the collapse of medical infrastructure. Civilian and military casualties alike accumulated faster than any formal system could address, creating a logistical nightmare that demanded immediate intervention. The Nazi regime's response was pragmatic yet brutal. With manpower depleted and professional services destroyed or reassigned to the war front, authorities turned to civilians as a resource. Compelled by ideological indoctrination and the threat of punishment, ordinary Germans were instructed to remove, transport, and bury the dead. These operations were not symbolic gestures of respect. They were emergency measures to maintain urban hygiene, prevent disease, and restore minimal order amidst the chaos. In practice, the scale of the task was immense. A single bombing raid could produce hundreds of corpses across a few square kilometers, each requiring identification, movement, and interment. Mass graves were dug in parks, courtyards, and along riverbanks, often with rudimentary tools such as shovels, pickaxes, or wheelbarrows. The process itself was harrowing. Civilians worked in teams, often under the supervision of local Nazi officials or police. The dead were first located, sometimes partially buried in rubble, and then carefully, or in many cases hastily, exhumed. Corpses were placed onto stretchers or makeshift sleds and transported to temporary holding areas or directly to mass graves. Decomposition, exposure to fire, or trauma from collapsing structures added a gruesome layer to the labor, making the handling of bodies both physically exhausting and psychologically traumatic. Reports from survivors describe the overwhelming odor of decay, the sight of mutilated bodies, and the constant presence of flies and scavenging animals, conditions that left indelible marks on those forced to participate. Tools and methods were basic yet adapted to the exigencies of the situation. Wooden stretchers, wheelbarrows, and ropes were employed to move bodies. Shovels and spades were used to dig mass graves rapidly. In areas where soil was frozen, teams relied on pickaxes, crowbars, or even explosives to break through debris. The use of carts and trucks was limited, as fuel shortages and damaged infrastructure constrained transportation. Civilians often worked in long shifts, exposed to the elements, and sometimes under the threat of ongoing air raids, which compounded the danger. The combination of physical exhaustion, emotional trauma, and the constant reminder of mortality created a uniquely oppressive labor environment. The scale of these operations is difficult to comprehend. In cities like Dresden or Hamburg, bombings could result in thousands of casualties in a single night. Entire streets had to be cleared, bodies stacked or arranged in trenches, and debris removed to access the deceased. In some cases, civilians worked for days on end, often sleeping in makeshift camps nearby or returning home to devastated households between shifts. Children were sometimes pressed into service, carrying small tools, helping transport corpses, or performing menial support tasks. The moral and emotional toll of this work was immense. Individuals were forced to confront the fragility of life, the randomness of death, and the inefficiency of the system that compelled their labor. The organization of burial operations reflected the Nazi regime's obsession with order and efficiency, even in the face of chaos. Teams were often assigned to specific districts or streets, with detailed instructions on how to prioritize bodies, identify the dead when possible, and record burials for administrative purposes. Where records could not be kept, corpses were often marked with simple wooden crosses or stones, or left unmarked in mass graves. The regime sought to balance the need for sanitation and public health with the demands of military and administrative control, a tension that placed civilians squarely in the role of both laborers and witnesses to the ongoing collapse of society. Yet even within this structured approach, the work was perilously inconsistent. Bombed-out cities were unpredictable environments. Buildings could collapse without warning, unexploded ordnance threatened injury or death, and disease spread quickly among those handling decomposing bodies. Civilians had no protective equipment beyond whatever clothing they could muster, and the psychological burden of constant exposure to corpses, often their neighbors or acquaintances, was profound. Many described feelings of numbness, despair, and guilt, struggling to reconcile the necessity of their labor with the moral revulsion it provoked. The sheer ubiquity of death made it impossible to avoid the task. In many cases, failure to participate meant immediate punishment by local authorities or social ostracism. Compounding these challenges was the unpredictability of wartime conditions. Civilians often had to work while bombs continued to fall, artillery shells exploded nearby, or the front lines shifted suddenly. Air raids could disrupt operations mid-task, forcing teams to abandon bodies temporarily or work under extreme pressure to complete burials before the next attack. In areas of active combat, the presence of soldiers and partisan forces added additional hazards, further emphasizing the coerced and dangerous nature of the work. Survival often depended on speed, obedience, and the ability to suppress emotional responses to the horrors encountered daily. Despite these conditions, the labor performed by civilians was crucial in preventing further catastrophe. Mass graves mitigated the spread of disease, reduced the visibility of death in urban centers, and allowed some level of continued civic function, however fragile. These acts of coerced labor, though horrific, were framed by the regime as necessary contributions to the survival of the community and the nation, a grim echo of the ideological conditioning described in earlier sections. Civilians were forced into the dual role of mourner and worker, confronting mortality in both intimate and systemic dimensions. In examining the logistics of mass death, one sees how total war eroded the boundaries between civilian and military life. Ordinary Germans, already traumatized by bombings, starvation, and displacement, became enforcers of survival, handling the dead with a grim efficiency born of necessity. The breakdown of official services, combined with ideological pressure and the tangible presence of coercion, meant that the burden of burial fell upon those least equipped to bear it. In this context, the task of clearing corpses was not merely a practical response to catastrophe, but a forced immersion in the moral and psychological consequences of state-directed violence. The labor required, the conditions endured, and the scale of the operations reveal a chilling reality. The collapse of Germany did not merely involve the loss of territory or infrastructure, It involved the systematic exposure of civilians to death on a mass scale. The combination of overwhelming mortality, ideological coercion, and societal collapse created a situation in which ordinary people were transformed into participants in the maintenance of life amid the omnipresence of death. The logistics of mass burial, therefore, were not only a testament to the organizational demands of war, but also a stark illustration of the human cost exacted by the convergence of ideology, coercion, and total societal collapse. For the ordinary German civilian in the final months of World War II, life had become an unrelenting cycle of fear, labor, and grief. The destruction of cities and the collapse of societal infrastructure were compounded by the constant presence of death, turning everyday existence into a landscape of horror. Civilians were confronted not only with the bodies of strangers killed in bombing raids or street executions, but, in many cases, with the corpses of neighbors, friends, and even family members. The work of burial, mandated by Nazi authorities, transformed individuals into reluctant participants in the management of death, exposing them to both physical strain and profound psychological trauma. Eyewitness testimonies reveal the intensity of the emotional burden. A woman in Berlin described being forced to dig trenches in a park where dozens of bodies had been deposited after an air raid. "I saw my neighbor, the man who delivered milk every morning, lying there, his face unrecognizable. I had to move him with my own hands. I could not cry, not even scream. The Gestapo was watching, and there was no choice." Such accounts illustrate the duality of experience: the personal confrontation with mortality and the external pressure of coercion. Civilians had little space for mourning or reflection. The labor itself demanded suppression of emotion, a necessity that compounded long-term psychological distress. The moral conflict inherent in these acts cannot be overstated. Many civilians described feelings of guilt, shame, and self-reproach. Handling the dead, especially neighbors or children, forced individuals to reconcile survival with complicity. Diaries and letters from the period reveal a recurring struggle: the awareness of what was being done versus the perceived inability to refuse. In some cases, individuals attempted to preserve dignity for the dead, covering corpses with blankets or marking graves with stones, gestures that allowed them to retain a semblance of humanity amidst the dehumanizing work. Even small acts of care became acts of moral resistance, though they did little to mitigate the psychological weight of the labor itself. The daily realities of life for those compelled into burial operations were grueling. Work often began at dawn, extending long into the night, interrupted only by air raids or shifts in military activity. The physical environment was hostile: rubble-strewn streets, collapsed buildings, and lingering fire damage created dangerous working conditions. Civilians carried bodies over uneven terrain, dug graves by hand, and attempted to organize the dead amidst debris and chaos. Exposure to the elements, rain, snow, cold, and heat, added to exhaustion. Food and water were scarce, medical care for injuries almost non-existent, and sleep a rare luxury. The combination of physical fatigue and emotional trauma created a pervasive state of despair. Fear was omnipresent. Civilians faced danger from multiple sources. Bombs continued to fall unpredictably, artillery fire reached urban centers, and the threat of Gestapo reprisal loomed over any perceived hesitation or refusal to work. For many, the labor of burying the dead was inseparable from the instinct for self-preservation. Yet survival demanded not only obedience but also emotional fortitude, as every act of compliance required confronting horrors that defied comprehension. Those who faltered risked punishment, social ostracism, or worse. Those who endured were left with indelible psychological scars. Testimonies describe the unique torment of being forced to bury loved ones. A man from Dresden recounted the day his teenage son was killed in a bombing raid. "I had to place him in a trench with others. I held his hand as I lowered him. I could not leave him behind, and yet I was compelled to act as if it were just another body. Every man, woman, and child became indistinguishable. "I cannot forget it." The act of interring family members alongside strangers magnified the trauma, eroding distinctions between personal grief and the collective horror imposed by war. Such experiences illustrate how the regime's coercion extended beyond labor to reshape the moral and emotional landscape of the population. Community networks, while strained, sometimes provided limited solace. Neighbors assisted one another in clearing rubble, transporting bodies, or sharing scarce provisions. These small acts of cooperation offered brief respite from the crushing burden of work and fear, but they could not shield civilians from the omnipresent violence or the psychological impact of repeated exposure to death. Even within families, children were often drawn into the labor, carrying small tools, aiding in transportation, or providing support, an experience that would leave lasting impressions of trauma and loss. The psychological consequences were immediate and long-term. Civilians reported symptoms consistent with what modern psychiatry would recognize as post-traumatic stress: nightmares, flashbacks, emotional numbness, and heightened anxiety. The repeated confrontation with death, often in intimate and personal contexts, disrupted normal emotional processing. Individuals described feelings of helplessness, despair, and moral disorientation, grappling with questions of complicity and survival. The trauma extended beyond the duration of the labor itself, shaping post-war experiences, relationships, and perceptions of morality. The experience of women and children was particularly harrowing. Women were often tasked with both burial labor and domestic responsibilities, managing households in ruins while also performing forced labor in streets or bombed courtyards. Children, exposed to death and destruction from a young age, were forced into roles that accelerated their confrontation with mortality. The normalization of corpses as part of daily life, coupled with coercion from authorities, disrupted childhood and adolescence, imprinting memories of horror that would persist across lifetimes. Survivors later described difficulty forming emotional connections or confronting loss in ordinary circumstances, a reflection of the psychological imprint of wartime labor. Exhaustion, both physical and emotional, became a defining feature of civilian life. The relentless pace of work, scarcity of food, and constant fear of attack created a state of chronic fatigue. Civilians often described moving through tasks as if in a daze, performing duties with mechanical efficiency while suppressing fear, grief, and moral reflection. The combination of manual labor, exposure to corpses, and ongoing threats created an environment in which survival itself became a form of desensitization, a coping mechanism to endure circumstances no human being should face. The moral ambiguity imposed by Nazi coercion was compounded by the collapse of social norms. Ordinary ethical frameworks, respect for life, community responsibility, empathy, were repeatedly challenged by the demands of survival and obedience. Civilians were forced to navigate a landscape in which refusal to act carried immediate consequences, while compliance inflicted profound psychological harm. This tension created a pervasive sense of moral dislocation, a recognition that ordinary rules no longer applied, and that every decision carried weighty, often tragic, consequences. Long-term consequences were profound. Survivors of forced burial operations reported enduring trauma well into adulthood. Many experienced persistent nightmares, anxiety in situations involving death, and guilt over actions they had performed under duress. Relationships with family members and communities were often strained by the inability to reconcile shared experiences of trauma. Psychologists studying post-war Germany noted elevated levels of stress-related disorders among those exposed to mass death and coerced labor, a reflection of the cumulative psychological toll of these final months. Even amidst this horror, civilians demonstrated resilience and resourcefulness. Diaries, letters, and oral histories reveal acts of small defiance or moral courage, taking care in handling corpses, secretly marking graves, offering comfort to others, or quietly resisting orders when possible. These acts, though often limited by circumstance, underscores the persistence of human dignity and ethical reasoning even under extreme duress. Civilians navigated a precarious balance between survival, coerced compliance, and moral integrity, negotiating a daily existence defined by extraordinary constraints. The civilian experience of forced burial operations thus represents one of the most intimate intersections of war, ideology, and human endurance. The labor demanded not only physical exertion but moral negotiation, confronting individuals with questions of life, death, and ethical responsibility under conditions of coercion. In witnessing and handling death on such a massive and personal scale, civilians absorbed the consequences of both war and authoritarian control. Their experiences provide a window into the human cost of total war, revealing the ways in which ordinary individuals were compelled to navigate moral, emotional, and physical peril simultaneously. Ultimately, the narratives of civilians forced to bury the dead underscore the depth of trauma imposed by the collapse of Germany and the coercive machinery of the Nazi state. They illustrate how ideology, fear, and total war intersected to create a reality in which moral agency was constrained, survival demanded complicity, and psychological endurance became a daily necessity. The labor of burial, horrific in both scale and intensity, left enduring marks on those who performed it, shaping the collective memory of a society caught in the grip of destruction, coercion, and mortality. The civilian experience, therefore, is not merely a historical footnote, but a critical lens through which to understand the human consequences of totalitarian rule and mass conflict. By examining the stories, testimonies, and psychological impact of those forced to bury family, neighbors, and strangers, one can comprehend the depth of trauma and moral complexity inherent in life under siege. The experiences of these individuals bridge the gap between historical events and human experience, providing insight into the intersection of ideology, coercion, and survival in one of history's darkest chapters. As the German war effort crumbled, the role of the SS and other Nazi authorities extended far beyond traditional military operations, reaching deep into civilian life. In the chaotic cities of late 1944 and early 1945, these organizations became the instruments of coercion, enforcing the regime's decrees with ruthless efficiency. Ordinary Germans, already burdened by the devastation of bombings and the collapse of infrastructure, now faced the additional pressure of direct supervision by armed enforcers tasked with ensuring obedience to the regime's directives. Among these directives, one of the most psychologically and physically demanding was the forced participation in burial operations, a task that exposed civilians to both the horrors of mass death and the unyielding authority of the SS. The presence of the SS in urban centers was both pervasive and intimidating. Officers patrolled streets and neighborhoods, often accompanied by local police or auxiliary units, observing civilian behavior and issuing immediate orders. Their authority was absolute, compliance was mandatory, and hesitation or refusal could result in severe punishment. In practice, this meant that civilians were compelled to perform grueling labor, moving and burying the dead under the watchful eyes of armed men who had little tolerance for dissent. The SS framed these tasks as essential to maintaining public order, hygiene, and the broader objectives of the war, yet the methods of enforcement relied heavily on fear, intimidation, and terror. Punitive measures for non-compliance were swift and severe. Reports from survivors indicate that civilians who hesitated, expressed moral objection, or failed to complete assigned burial tasks were subjected to public reprimand, arrest, or even execution. The SS cultivated a climate of terror designed to eliminate resistance before it could emerge. In some towns, individuals who refused to participate were tied to the very corpses they had been ordered to bury, left in public view as warnings to others. Others were forcibly conscripted into labor details under armed guard, with failure to comply sometimes resulting in immediate corporal punishment or summary execution. The message was clear: obedience was not optional, and the consequences of defiance were lethal. The SS also enforced participation through subtle but pervasive methods of surveillance and peer pressure. Civilians were often compelled to work in groups, with officers monitoring each team and noting any signs of reluctance or dissent. Reports of neighbors informing on each other, a practice encouraged and rewarded by local authorities, intensified the atmosphere of mutual suspicion. In this way, coercion extended beyond the immediate presence of armed officers, permeating social networks and ensuring that compliance was maintained even in moments when direct supervision was not feasible. The psychological impact of such oversight cannot be overstated. Civilians were forced to navigate a complex moral landscape, balancing the need for personal survival with the abhorrent demands of the regime. The presence of armed officers and the threat of punitive measures created a constant state of anxiety, compounding the already traumatic effects of handling corpses and witnessing widespread death. In many cases, individuals reported feeling as though their every action was scrutinized, their autonomy stripped away, and their capacity for moral choice constrained by fear. This dynamic illustrates the intersection of ideological control and physical coercion that characterized Nazi governance in the final months of the war. In addition to individual punishment, the SS imposed collective penalties on entire neighborhoods or work teams when directives were not followed. Entire blocks might be temporarily sealed off, with residents forced to participate in extended burial operations under threat of mass arrest or execution. These collective measures served both practical and symbolic purposes. They ensured the completion of labor-intensive tasks while reinforcing the perception that the regime's authority was absolute and inescapable. The terror generated by such measures created a climate in which civilians internalized obedience, often performing horrific labor with mechanical efficiency to avoid punitive consequences. Survivor testimonies emphasize the brutality of these punitive measures. A man in Dresden recalled being forced to remove bodies from a collapsed building under the supervision of an SS officer. "I hesitated because I recognized a neighbor under the rubble. The officer struck me across the face with his rifle and shouted that hesitation would cost my life. I worked without pause, but the memory of that blow haunts me still." Instances like this were tragically common, illustrating the regime's willingness to enforce compliance through immediate, often violent, means. The combination of physical intimidation and moral coercion ensured that civilians, despite exhaustion and trauma, continued to perform tasks they might have otherwise resisted. The SS also leveraged symbolic acts of terror to reinforce authority. Public executions of individuals accused of defiance were conducted in some cities, intended to serve as warnings to others. The regime's propaganda machinery often amplified these events, framing them as necessary measures to maintain order, thus embedding a moral rationale within the coercive structure. Civilians, already traumatized by destruction and loss, were compelled to witness these acts or hear of them, further reinforcing compliance through fear and shaping perceptions of unavoidable authority. Moreover, the SS oversight extended to the minutiae of burial operations. Officers dictated methods of handling bodies, placement in mass graves, and procedures for temporary storage or transport. Civilians were not permitted to improvise freely. Deviations from prescribed procedures were met with punishment. Even small errors, such as improperly stacking corpses or failing to clear rubble efficiently, could provoke reprimand or physical assault. This micromanagement highlights the regime's obsession with order and control, even in the midst of widespread societal collapse, and demonstrates the extent to which civilians were rendered instruments of both logistical necessity and ideological enforcement. The dual pressures of physical labor and ideological coercion created profound psychological strain. Civilians internalized the threat of SS oversight, often performing acts of burial with intense fear of immediate reprisal. The constant presence of authority figures, combined with a knowledge of potential punishment, eroded personal autonomy and heightened moral distress. Many civilians later described feelings of helplessness and despair, recognizing that survival depended not only on completing the work but on maintaining compliance under threat of violence. These experiences left lasting scars, contributing to a complex post-war legacy of guilt, trauma, and moral reckoning. By late 1944, Germany's great cities had become unrecognizable. Berlin, once a bustling capital, Dresden, celebrated for its cultural and architectural grandeur, and Hamburg, a major industrial hub, had been transformed into landscapes of ruin. The relentless Allied bombing campaigns had systematically reduced urban centers to smoldering skeletons, streets fractured by rubble, and neighborhoods littered with the dead. In these cities, civilians moved through an environment where destruction and death were omnipresent, a daily reality in which survival, labor, and the management of corpses became inseparable from ordinary existence. Berlin exemplified the scale of devastation and the challenges it presented. By early 1945, repeated air raids had left large portions of the city in ruins, with entire streets flattened and residential blocks obliterated. Civilians navigating the city encountered collapsed buildings at nearly every turn, with corpses partially visible beneath rubble or lying exposed in streets. The familiar urban landscape had been transformed into a labyrinth of destruction, forcing residents to negotiate dangerous terrain while performing the grim task of burial. Bridges were destroyed, transportation systems crippled, and communication lines severed, creating logistical obstacles for civilians attempting to move bodies from bombed-out structures to temporary holding areas or mass graves. In Dresden, the firebombing of February 1945 left a particularly haunting legacy. Flames consumed whole districts within hours, creating firestorms that killed tens of thousands of residents in a single night. Streets were strewn with corpses, some burned beyond recognition, others partially buried in rubble. For civilians tasked with clearing the dead, the physical demands were immense. Trenches had to be dug in frozen or ash-covered soil, and bodies, sometimes stacked to conserve space, were moved with minimal equipment. Survivors described working through smoke, heat, and debris, often under the constant threat of additional raids or structural collapse. In this environment, the labor of burial was both urgent and horrifying, demanding not only physical strength but emotional resilience. Hamburg, another industrial and port city, experienced a similar fate. The July 1943 firestorm had long-term repercussions, leaving vast areas of the city flattened, while continued bombings in 1944 and 1945 compounded the devastation. Civilians were forced to navigate streets impassable to vehicles, improvising pathways through rubble to reach corpses or grave sites. The logistical complexity of the task was immense. Bodies had to be transported across debris-strewn streets, sometimes over collapsed bridges or along waterways, while teams coordinated digging operations and temporary storage. Tools were rudimentary, often limited to shovels, pickaxes, and wheelbarrows, and the labor was physically exhausting, particularly in the winter months when frozen ground impeded excavation. The term "dead streets" emerged to describe the eerie, desolate conditions of these urban centers. Streets once filled with life were now dominated by silence, interrupted only by the creaking of makeshift stretchers, the muffled sounds of digging, and the distant rumble of artillery or bombing. Civilians moving through these spaces encountered the omnipresence of death. Neighbors, strangers, and even children had perished, their bodies left exposed or hastily interred. The visual and olfactory reality of mass death was overwhelming. Survivors later recounted the pervasive smell of smoke, decay, and human remains, combined with the sight of charred, dismembered, or decomposing corpses, creating a sensory environment that reinforced both fear and a numbing sense of inevitability. Navigating this urban landscape required careful planning and coordination, yet chaos was the defining feature. Streets were often blocked by rubble or collapsed buildings, forcing civilians to improvise routes and lifting corpses over obstacles. Mass graves were dug wherever open ground could be found, in parks, courtyards, or riverbanks, often in close proximity to rubble-strewn streets. Civilians worked in teams, with some individuals tasked with locating bodies, others with transporting them, and still others with digging graves or supervising the operations. The work was physically taxing and psychologically grueling, requiring continuous exposure to horrific scenes of death while maintaining efficiency under the supervision of Nazi authorities. The scale of destruction in these urban centers amplified the moral and emotional strain on civilians. Many encountered family members, friends, or neighbors among the dead, a reality that intensified the psychological toll of the labor. Diaries and memoirs describe moments of paralyzed grief, temporary breakdowns, and attempts to preserve the dignity of the deceased, even amidst mass interments. Yet the relentless pace of the work, combined with fear of reprisals from the SS or local officials, left little room for prolonged mourning. Civilians were forced to suppress emotion to survive, a coping mechanism that allowed them to complete tasks but often left lasting psychological scars. Weather conditions added further difficulty. Winter cold froze the ground, impeding excavation, while rain and snow created treacherous footing and accelerated decomposition, worsening both the physical and olfactory environment. Summer months brought heat, which intensified the stench of corpses and accelerated decay, creating an unbearable working atmosphere. Civilians had to maintain constant vigilance, not only to complete their labor, but also to avoid structural hazards, unexploded ordnance, and potential air raids, which could strike without warning. The interplay of environmental hazards, logistical challenges, and constant threat of violence made each day a precarious struggle for both survival and compliance. The logistical nightmare extended beyond the immediate removal of corpses. Civilians also had to manage limited tools, coordinate teams, and identify suitable burial sites, all while working under supervision. Fuel shortages, destroyed roads, and broken bridges further complicated transportation, forcing laborers to carry bodies over long distances or improvise methods to move corpses through the ruins. Makeshift vehicles, carts, or stretchers were pressed into service, and civilians frequently rotated between physically demanding tasks, including digging, lifting, and stacking, often with minimal rest or nourishment. This continuous cycle of labor contributed to physical exhaustion and emotional numbness, reinforcing the dehumanizing experience of managing death on such a vast scale. Social dynamics within these work teams were also shaped by the extreme environment. Civilians often relied on one another for practical support, such as sharing tools, lifting heavy corpses, or guiding teams through rubble-strewn streets. Yet the psychological pressure was constant. Everyone knew that any hesitation could result in punishment, public shaming, or even execution. The combination of coercion and shared trauma created a tense environment in which solidarity coexisted with fear, and trust was both essential and precarious. Civilians were forced to navigate not only the ruins of their cities, but also the moral and emotional complexities imposed by totalitarian oversight and extreme circumstances. The experience of urban destruction was not confined to the immediate act of burial. Civilians lived in environments where death was omnipresent, influencing daily routines and perceptions of safety. Streets and neighborhoods were marked by the presence of corpses, rubble, and constant reminders of violence. Civilians adapted by altering routines, avoiding certain areas, or coordinating labor schedules to minimize exposure to danger. Yet the pervasive destruction ensured that the psychological and physical toll of daily life remained intense, a continuous engagement with the consequences of war that left few opportunities for relief or normalcy. In many ways, the dead streets became a defining characteristic of Germany's final months. Civilians were forced to negotiate landscapes that were at once physically treacherous and morally complex. The combination of destruction, mass death, and coercive oversight by Nazi authorities created an environment in which survival, labor, and complicity were inextricably linked. Individuals confronted horror at every turn. Bombed-out buildings, charred corpses, collapsed streets, and the ever-present threat of punishment formed a continuous backdrop to the struggle for life and order. The experience of navigating these streets, performing labor under duress, and witnessing the scale of urban annihilation constitutes one of the most vivid illustrations of the human cost of total war. Urban destruction also left an indelible mark on memory and testimony. Survivors' recollections frequently emphasize the overwhelming scale of devastation, the sensory assault of decaying bodies and smoke, and the moral dilemmas imposed by coerced labor. These narratives reveal not only the logistical challenges faced by civilians, but also the profound psychological imprint of witnessing mass death in such immediate and intimate contexts. Cities like Berlin, Dresden, and Hamburg were transformed into landscapes of horror, where ordinary individuals were drawn into the management of mortality, their labor a grim necessity amid societal collapse. Amid the ruins of Germany's cities, the presence of unburied corpses presented an acute and immediate public health crisis. Civilians, forced by the Nazi regime to participate in burial operations, were thrust into the intersection of human suffering and biological danger. The breakdown of municipal services, combined with the scale of death from bombings, executions, and starvation, created an environment in which the potential for disease was extraordinarily high. In these conditions, the labor imposed upon civilians, gruesome and traumatizing as it was, became, inadvertently, a critical intervention in mitigating the spread of contagion. The risk of disease arose from multiple factors. Corpses exposed to the elements decomposed rapidly, particularly in the warmer months, releasing bacteria, bodily fluids, and other pathogens into the surrounding environment. Streets, parks, and courtyards littered with bodies became vectors for contamination, threatening both those handling the dead and the wider population. Survivors described the overwhelming stench of decay, which pervaded bombed-out districts, infiltrating homes and shelters. The exposure to such conditions was not merely unpleasant, it was a direct threat to human health, increasing the likelihood of infections and systemic disease. Among the most pressing concerns were outbreaks of typhus, dysentery, and other waterborne or vector-borne illnesses. These diseases were exacerbated by damaged water and sanitation systems, which had been disrupted by bombing campaigns and the collapse of municipal services. Civilians drawing water from contaminated sources risked ingesting pathogens, while handling corpses without protective measures created further opportunities for infection. Flies, rats, and other scavengers acted as vectors, moving pathogens from decomposing bodies to areas where the population sought food or shelter. In this environment, public health hazards were omnipresent, and the urgency of burial operations was as much a medical imperative as it was an administrative or ideological one. The methods employed by civilians were necessarily rudimentary. Corpses were transported using wheelbarrows, stretchers, or improvised sleds, and mass graves were dug with spades or pickaxes. Protective clothing was minimal, and soap, disinfectant, or gloves were often unavailable. Civilians risked direct contact with bodily fluids, inhalation of bacteria-laden dust, and cuts or puncture wounds from rubble or debris. The combination of physical exposure and exhaustion increased susceptibility to illness, and many laborers reported developing fevers, rashes, or gastrointestinal problems shortly after participating in burial operations. The forced work, while vital to the containment of disease, imposed a direct health burden on those performing it. The scale of the health hazard was staggering in urban centers like Berlin, Dresden, and Hamburg. In densely populated areas flattened by bombings, hundreds or even thousands of corpses could remain exposed for days before burial. In the interim, decomposing bodies contaminated the soil and water, creating localized zones of extreme hazard. Civilians moving through these areas faced constant risk, while survivors living nearby were forced to contend with odors, insect infestations, and the psychological strain of proximity to death. Medical facilities, already overwhelmed by wartime casualties, were largely incapable of responding, leaving prevention through burial as the primary intervention against outbreaks. Disease was not limited to bacterial infection alone. Exposure to smoke, chemical residues from incendiary devices, and airborne particulate matter from destroyed infrastructure compounded respiratory hazards. Civilians working in bombed-out streets reported persistent coughing, eye irritation, and difficulty breathing, symptoms that were often exacerbated by direct exposure to decomposing bodies. These compounded health risks illustrate how the intersection of warfare, destruction, and forced labor created conditions in which the act of burying the dead was simultaneously a psychological, physical, and medical ordeal. In many cases, the Nazis framed burial operations in practical terms. Removing corpses was necessary to prevent the spread of disease, maintain hygiene, and preserve a minimal semblance of urban functionality. Yet the coercive methods employed, forcing civilians to work under armed supervision, without tools or protective equipment, meant that public health objectives were achieved at an extraordinary human cost. Individuals endured exhaustion, trauma, and direct exposure to pathogens, yet the completion of burial operations was crucial in averting epidemics that could have claimed thousands more lives. This dual reality underscores the intersection of horror and necessity, in which coerced labor became both a moral and medical imperative. The risks extended beyond immediate infection. Handling corpses exposed civilians to long-term health consequences, including chronic respiratory illness, lingering gastrointestinal disorders, and increased susceptibility to infections due to compromised immunity from fatigue and malnutrition. Psychological stress also compounded physical vulnerability. Constant exposure to death, combined with fear of punishment and exhaustion, weakened immune responses, leaving civilians more prone to illness. The combination of physical, biological, and emotional stressors created a uniquely hazardous environment, one in which survival depended on navigating both visible and invisible threats. Civilians developed ad hoc strategies to reduce risk where possible. Some wrapped corpses in cloth or blankets, partially shielding themselves from direct contact. Others improvised protective layers from clothing or used sticks to manipulate bodies without direct handling. Water from rivers or makeshift wells was sometimes boiled when feasible, though fuel shortages limited such measures. Despite these adaptations, exposure was inevitable. Survival relied as much on endurance and improvisation as it did on obedience to orders, highlighting the precarious balance between life, labor, and disease management. The scale and intensity of burial operations meant that public health intervention occurred within an atmosphere of extreme duress. In effect, civilians were performing emergency sanitation work under conditions that would have been unacceptable under ordinary circumstances. Mass graves, temporary holding areas, and organized disposal of corpses served to limit the spread of typhus, cholera, and other epidemic diseases, yet they did so at enormous cost to those executing the labor. Historians and public health researchers note that without these forced civilian interventions, urban populations may have faced even higher mortality rates, compounding the already catastrophic impact of warfare on Germany's cities. The relationship between coercion and health intervention illustrates a cruel paradox. The very mechanisms used to enforce compliance, the threat of SS oversight, punishment, and social pressure, ensured that a form of life-saving labor was performed. Civilians, acting under duress, became agents of public health while simultaneously confronting moral, psychological, and physical trauma. This intersection of terror, coercion, and necessity exemplifies the extraordinary human cost of totalitarian governance and total war, where survival depended not only on avoiding death from bombing or reprisals, but also on participating in acts that preserved the broader population at personal peril. As civilians labored amidst ruins, handling corpses and navigating the omnipresent hazards of wartime cities, they faced ethical challenges of an extraordinary nature. The very act of burying the dead, forced under the threat of punishment, transformed simple labor into a moral crucible. Individuals were compelled to reconcile the instinct for survival with deeply held human values: respect for life, empathy, and a sense of justice. The tensions between obedience and humanity, survival and conscience, defined daily existence, creating dilemmas that would haunt survivors for decades. In Berlin, Dresden, and Hamburg, civilians confronted situations that tested the boundaries of moral judgment. An elderly man in Dresden recalled lifting the body of a young girl from the rubble. "I recognized her from the neighborhood. I wanted to shield her, to preserve something of her dignity. But the officer was watching. I had to continue, my hands trembling. "I hated myself for doing what was necessary." Such accounts illustrate the painful negotiation between coercion and ethical impulse. The presence of SS oversight, the threat of execution, and the physical demands of labor constrained choices, yet even within these confines, individuals sought small avenues to assert humanity. Covering a corpse with a blanket, marking a grave with a personal token, or carefully arranging bodies reflected a silent resistance, an attempt to retain moral agency under impossible circumstances. Acts of defiance, though often subtle, reveal the persistence of conscience in extreme conditions. Some civilians altered burial procedures to provide minimal dignity to the dead, concealing small personal effects or attempting to differentiate children from adults in mass graves. Others offered small comforts to co-workers, sharing food or water during exhausting shifts, or quietly refusing to carry out particularly egregious orders when risk could be mitigated. These gestures, often imperceptible to observers, underscore the capacity for ethical reasoning even under coercion, and the ways individuals navigated the tension between survival and morality. Resistance, however, was fraught with danger. Civilian hesitation or refusal could prompt immediate punitive measures, from physical abuse to execution. Entire neighborhoods sometimes suffered collective punishment when individuals attempted to subvert orders, creating a moral calculus in which the well-being of one person was inseparable from the lives of many others. Survivors often described a constant weighing of risk and ethical imperative, in which the right course of action was obscured by the omnipresent threat of lethal reprisal. This environment of coercion forced civilians into ethical ambiguity. The choice to act morally could result in personal or communal catastrophe, while compliance often demanded morally compromising behavior. Philosophical reflections emerge naturally from these circumstances. How does one judge the actions of individuals coerced into complicity? Can obedience under threat absolve moral responsibility, or is the act itself intrinsically binding? Historical and psychological scholarship suggests that extreme coercion profoundly shapes human behavior, constraining choice while amplifying the moral consequences of unavoidable action. Civilians in wartime Germany exemplified this tension, performing labor to prevent further public health crises, maintain urban hygiene, or preserve personal survival, yet often at the cost of ethical compromise. Their experiences highlight the complexities inherent in moral judgment under conditions of extreme duress. The struggle between ethical responsibility and survival extended beyond physical labor to daily interactions and decisions. Civilians negotiating scarce resources, food, water, shelter, were forced into moral trade-offs. Decisions about who would perform burial labor, how to allocate tools, or which corpses to prioritize involved both practical and ethical considerations. Individuals confronted the necessity of survival alongside the imperatives of compassion, creating a morally ambiguous landscape in which every action carried weighty consequences. These quotidian choices, while less dramatic than acts of outright defiance, were fundamental to the lived experience of wartime civilians, shaping both immediate outcomes and long-term moral memory. Stories of moral negotiation also reveal the profound human capacity for empathy, even amidst horror. Some civilians quietly comforted co-workers struggling with the psychological toll of handling corpses. Others provided small measures of solace to children drawn into burial labor, offering protective gestures or brief moments of distraction. These acts, while limited in scope, demonstrate the persistence of ethical reflection and human concern even under coercion. They illuminate the ways individuals attempted to preserve dignity, for themselves, for the dead, and for one another, despite the constraints imposed by totalitarian oversight. The ethical dilemmas were compounded by the scale of death. Handling dozens or hundreds of corpses in a single day desensitized many to individual suffering, creating tension between empathy and the mechanical demands of survival. Civilians struggled to maintain moral awareness while performing repetitive, physically exhausting labor, and many later described feelings of guilt, shame, or moral dislocation. Such responses illustrate the psychological mechanisms by which humans negotiate ethical boundaries under extreme stress, balancing survival, obedience, and conscience in ways that defy simple moral judgment. Philosophical reflection on these experiences has generated broader questions about human behavior under coercion. Totalitarian regimes, by design, create conditions in which ordinary individuals confront impossible choices, constrained by both physical threat and ideological pressure. The forced burial of the dead in Germany's cities exemplifies this dynamic. Individuals were made instruments of a system they could neither resist freely nor fully endorse, compelled to act in ways that simultaneously preserved life, mitigated disease, and contributed to moral compromise. These circumstances challenged traditional frameworks of moral evaluation, suggesting that ethical behavior must be understood within its historical and situational context. Moral dilemmas were further intensified by the psychological consequences of labor. Repeated exposure to corpses, the omnipresence of death, and the supervision of armed authorities created conditions in which moral reflection became both urgent and painful. Civilians frequently reported intrusive memories, persistent guilt, and questions of complicity that lasted long after the war's end. The ethical challenges were not abstract. They were lived, embodied, and deeply personal, shaping individual and collective memory. The intersection of trauma and moral negotiation underscores the complexity of survival in extreme circumstances, revealing the ways in which coercion, ideology, and human conscience intersect. The experiences of resistance and quiet defiance offer important insights into the human capacity for ethical agency under constraint. Even small acts, burying a neighbor with care, shielding children from exposure to corpses, sharing tools or water, represent a conscious assertion of moral values in the face of systemic coercion. These gestures, while limited in their impact on the broader machinery of the Nazi state, allowed civilians to maintain a sense of personal integrity and to assert their humanity, however fleetingly. Such acts highlight the resilience of ethical reasoning, demonstrating that moral consciousness can persist even under extreme duress. In examining the moral dilemmas faced by civilians, one sees the interweaving of multiple pressures: the physical demands of labor, the threat of punishment, the psychological toll of witnessing death, and the imperatives of ethical reflection. Civilians navigated a landscape in which every decision involved trade-offs between survival, conscience, and compliance. The moral ambiguity inherent in these circumstances challenges simplistic judgments, emphasizing the importance of historical context in understanding human behavior. These experiences underscore that morality under coercion is rarely absolute. It is negotiated, contested, and inseparably linked to the exigencies of circumstance. The end of the war did not bring relief for the civilians who had been compelled to bury the dead. While the guns fell silent and the Allied armies occupied German cities, the psychological consequences of forced labor and exposure to mass death remained acute. Survivors faced the complex and enduring burden of trauma, a shadow that would shape their lives, families, and communities long after the physical ruins had been cleared. For many, the struggle was not only with memories of destruction and death, but also with the moral and emotional weight of coerced complicity, a tension that blurred the lines between victimhood and perceived responsibility. Psychological research and post-war accounts reveal that many survivors experienced symptoms consistent with what is now recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. Recurring nightmares, intrusive memories of corpses, and sudden flashbacks to bombed streets or mass graves were common. For some, the act of walking past burial sites or viewing cemeteries triggered waves of panic or guilt, highlighting how environmental cues could reignite trauma. Ordinary tasks, entering a city street, passing a demolished building, or even hearing a sudden noise reminiscent of an air raid, could provoke intense anxiety. Unlike soldiers whose trauma was framed within a military context, civilians faced the compounded horror of moral ambiguity. They had survived, yet often felt haunted by the roles they were forced to play in managing death. The psychological impact was intensified by the social environment of post-war Germany. Many survivors carried the additional burden of social stigma, particularly in communities where participation in forced labor had been highly visible. Neighbors, friends, and relatives often bore knowledge of each individual's role, and silence about these experiences became both a protective mechanism and a source of isolation. Adults who had worked alongside children or elderly neighbors in burial operations sometimes found themselves silently judged, even by those who had endured similar experiences. The tension between shared trauma and individual moral scrutiny created complex social dynamics, complicating communal recovery and leaving individuals feeling alienated in the very communities they had helped preserve. Memoirs and oral histories from the immediate post-war period reveal a common pattern. Survivors struggled to reconcile the dual realities of victimhood and coerced complicity. They had endured bombing, starvation, and the threat of execution, yet they had also been agents, albeit unwilling, of the regime's management of death. This cognitive dissonance fueled deep feelings of guilt and shame, often unspoken for decades. Some survivors reframed their experiences in silence, presenting themselves publicly as victims while privately grappling with the psychological weight of their coerced participation. Others attempted to contextualize their actions through narratives of necessity. Labor performed under duress, labor undertaken to prevent further suffering from disease or decomposition, labor carried out because refusal would have meant death. The emergence of post-war psychological studies provided insight into these complex experiences. Researchers in the 1950s and 1960s noted high rates of anxiety, depression, and psychosomatic illness among civilians exposed to mass death during the final months of the war. Common symptoms included sleep disturbances, hypervigilance, irritability, and chronic fatigue. Many survivors reported persistent feelings of guilt or moral failure, often accompanied by intense grief for family members, neighbors, or strangers they had buried. For some, the cumulative impact of physical exhaustion, malnutrition, and psychological trauma manifested in long-term health consequences, including cardiovascular issues and weakened immune responses. The act of remembering was itself a source of trauma. Survivors were often forced to recount events in legal or historical settings, for post-war tribunals or documentation projects, which could reopen psychological wounds. In some cases, collective memory became fragmented. Families and communities avoided discussing the horrors to protect children or maintain social cohesion, while survivors carried their memories alone. This tension between silence and disclosure created intergenerational effects, with children and grandchildren sensing the unspoken suffering of their parents or grandparents without fully understanding its origins. The burden of memory became an invisible inheritance, linking trauma across generations. Post-war reconstruction efforts inadvertently amplified these challenges. Cities rebuilt from ruins bore visible reminders of destruction. Streets where bodies had been buried, bombed-out neighborhoods, and memorials marking collective loss. Walking through these reconstructed landscapes could provoke intense recollection for those who had labored amidst the destruction. Survivors were thus forced to confront both personal memories and communal representations of loss simultaneously. The physical environment, once a site of labor and horror, became a repository of memory, making recovery both spatial and psychological. Survivors' writings reveal attempts to reconcile personal experiences with broader narratives of history. Memoirs often emphasize moral negotiation, ethical compromise, and the practical necessity of forced labor. Some authors framed their participation as a tragic but unavoidable act, performed to mitigate greater suffering or prevent further public health crises. Others expressed unrelenting guilt, acknowledging the horror of the labor while recognizing their inability to resist under threat of death. These writings collectively illustrate the tension between human agency and coercion, illuminating the moral and psychological complexity of civilian experience in wartime Germany. Commemorative projects and historical studies have helped contextualize these experiences, but for many individuals, acknowledgement arrived slowly. Official post-war narratives initially emphasized national victimhood, focusing on bombings, displacement, and the broader suffering of the civilian population. The specific experiences of those forced to bury the dead were often marginalized or subsumed within larger accounts of destruction. As a result, survivors sometimes felt doubly marginalized, traumatized by their experiences, yet unable to see their stories recognized or validated publicly. The emergence of more nuanced historiography in later decades gradually brought these narratives to the fore, offering validation but also reopening wounds through the process of remembrance. The moral and psychological struggles of survivors were compounded by the challenge of reintegration. Returning to civilian life required negotiating employment, housing, and family responsibilities while carrying the weight of traumatic memories. Former burial laborers often avoided social gatherings or avoided discussion of wartime experiences, fearing judgment or misunderstanding. In some cases, PTSD symptoms manifested in withdrawal, emotional numbing, or overcompensation through hyper-responsibility and perfectionism. Communities, too, had to confront shared trauma, balancing the need for collective recovery with the recognition of individual moral complexity. In post-war Germany, trauma from forced burial labor intersected with broader questions of justice and responsibility. Survivors often wrestled with the implications of complicity under coercion. Had they acted immorally, or had survival under threat of death justified their labor? Legal frameworks and war crime tribunals provided some clarity, punishing perpetrators while recognizing coercion as a mitigating factor. Yet these frameworks could not fully resolve the internal conflict experienced by civilians, leaving survivors to navigate the complex interplay of personal conscience, societal judgment, and historical accountability. Reconstructing the experiences of German civilians compelled to bury the dead requires meticulous engagement with historical documentation. Unlike military campaigns, where detailed operational records exist, the forced labor of burial was often undocumented or deliberately minimized by the Nazi regime. What historians have pieced together comes from a combination of archival sources, photographs, municipal records, survivor testimonies, and post-war investigations, each contributing a fragment to a larger and often unsettling picture. Photographic evidence, though limited, provides a stark visual testament to the scale of devastation. Images captured by Allied reconnaissance aircraft, clandestine wartime photographers, and post-war documentation reveal streets littered with rubble and bodies, mass graves in parks and courtyards, and civilians engaged in the physically grueling work of disposal. Some photographs, taken surreptitiously by German civilians or foreign journalists after the fall of cities, show the remnants of mass burial sites and improvised trenches, the scale of which conveys both the logistical challenge and the psychological weight of the labor. Yet photography alone cannot convey the human suffering or moral dilemmas experienced by those forced into this work. It must be interpreted alongside personal testimony and official records to form a comprehensive understanding. Official records, where they exist, offer insight into the bureaucratic machinery that orchestrated these operations. Municipal and police documents indicate the scale of labor mobilization, detailing assignments of individuals or groups to burial duties, the deployment of equipment, and coordination with public health authorities. Many records were destroyed in the chaos of the war's final months, and those that survived often omit the human dimension, focusing instead on efficiency or compliance. Historians have used these fragments to estimate the number of civilians involved, the geographic distribution of burial operations, and the approximate number of bodies managed, creating a framework for understanding the logistical magnitude of the task. Survivor testimonies are critical in bridging the gap between bureaucratic documentation and lived experience. Oral histories, memoirs, and interviews provide the intimate details that records and photographs cannot. The fear, exhaustion, and moral conflict endured by those forced to bury neighbors, strangers, and family members. These accounts reveal the emotional and ethical complexities of the labor, offering first-hand insight into conditions that official records obscure. Testimonies also clarify the interplay between coercion and agency, highlighting the subtle forms of resistance or negotiation employed by civilians to maintain a sense of dignity and moral integrity amid the horrors of war. Archival research has been supplemented by forensic studies of mass graves and burial sites. Archaeological investigations, particularly in cities like Dresden and Hamburg, have verified historical accounts of burial operations. Examination of soil layers, coffin remnants, and skeletal remains provides empirical evidence of both the scale of mortality and the methods employed in disposal. Forensic analysis confirms the descriptions of civilians regarding stacked bodies, shallow graves, and temporary burial trenches, lending credence to survivor testimony and helping reconstruct the practical realities of the operations. These investigations, while scientific in nature, also underscore the deeply human dimensions of the labor. Each skeletal fragment represents a life lost, a moral challenge faced, and a psychological burden borne by those compelled to perform the work. Despite the multiplicity of sources, significant gaps in documentation remain. The chaos of the war's final months, deliberate destruction of records by the regime, and the reluctance of survivors to speak publicly about their experiences have left areas of uncertainty. Precise casualty numbers for civilians forced into burial labor are difficult to determine, as are detailed accounts of specific operations in smaller towns or rural areas. Historians must therefore rely on triangulation, corroborating sparse records with photographic evidence, survivor testimony, and post-war municipal data to construct a plausible narrative. This patchwork approach highlights both the challenges of reconstructing history under conditions of destruction and the resilience of memory in preserving truth amid chaos. The relative invisibility of these events in broader historical narratives contributes to their marginalization. Discussions of World War II often focus on battlefield strategy, military leadership, or the Holocaust, leaving civilian experiences of forced burial underexplored. The nature of the labor, coerced, morally ambiguous, and psychologically taxing, complicates the narrative of victimhood and heroism. Historians face the challenge of integrating these experiences into a coherent historical framework without diminishing the agency of civilians or obscuring the coercive mechanisms of the Nazi regime. The ethical complexity of forced labor, combined with the fragmentary nature of documentation, makes this an area of study that requires careful, nuanced interpretation. Methodologically, historians have developed innovative approaches to overcome these challenges. Cross-referencing city planning records, wartime correspondence, and Allied reports has allowed researchers to reconstruct timelines and geographic patterns of burial operations. Oral history projects, initiated in the 1970s and 1980s, provided a platform for survivors to share experiences, creating primary sources that fill gaps left by lost or destroyed official records. Photogrammetry, GIS mapping, and digital archiving now allow for more precise visualization of destroyed urban spaces, revealing the scale of destruction and the logistical burden faced by civilians in performing burial labor. These methodologies underscore the combination of traditional archival research and modern technology in reconstructing complex historical events. The act of documenting these experiences also involves confronting ethical questions. Survivors' narratives often reveal extreme personal suffering and moral ambiguity, raising questions about the representation of trauma in historical work. Photographs of corpses, for instance, must be handled with sensitivity, balancing the need for evidence with respect for the deceased and their families. Oral histories require careful contextualization to preserve authenticity while protecting contributors from re-traumatization. Historians must navigate these challenges, ensuring that the reconstruction of events honors both factual accuracy and the dignity of those who lived through them. The process of reconstructing civilian experiences also illuminates broader patterns of human behavior under extreme coercion. Analysis of documentation reveals how fear, ideology, and necessity intersected to shape civilian participation in burial operations. Records show systematic mobilization by local authorities, while testimonies convey the psychological pressures that accompanied compliance. The combined evidence allows historians to understand both the structural forces imposed by the regime and the human strategies employed to navigate them. In doing so, These sources offer a multidimensional perspective on one of the lesser-known aspects of total war, highlighting both the scale of destruction and the moral and physical toll on ordinary citizens. Ultimately, the reconstruction of events relies on a delicate balance between material evidence, testimonial accounts, and interpretive analysis. The gaps in documentation, while challenging, do not obscure the overarching reality. German civilians faced extraordinary moral, physical, and psychological burdens in the forced burial of the dead. By piecing together fragmented records, photographs, and personal narratives, historians have succeeded in illuminating a history that was once overlooked, revealing the lived realities of coercion, survival, and ethical negotiation in the final months of the Third Reich. This work underscores the importance of diligent archival research, careful interpretation, and ethical sensitivity in reconstructing histories of human suffering. The forced participation of German civilians in burial operations during the final months of World War II, while extreme in its immediacy and psychological intensity, fits within a broader historical pattern of civilian coercion under conditions of war and totalitarian control. Across time and geography, regimes have compelled ordinary citizens to participate in labor that served both administrative and ideological ends, often imposing moral, physical, and psychological burdens comparable to those experienced in Germany. By examining these parallels, historians can situate the experiences of German civilians within a wider context, illuminating recurring dynamics of coercion, survival, and moral compromise. During the First World War, particularly in the Eastern Front campaigns, civilians were often pressed into service to manage the consequences of mass casualties and infrastructural collapse. Villagers along the front lines were tasked with clearing debris, burying dead soldiers, and assisting military logistics under the threat of violence or retaliation. The moral and physical dilemmas mirrored those faced in Germany decades later. Ordinary individuals had to navigate between immediate survival and ethical considerations, often performing labor that carried significant health risks and psychological trauma. While the scale and ideological framing differed, the underlying dynamics, coercion under threat, exposure to mass death, and moral ambiguity, were strikingly similar. The interwar period and subsequent rise of totalitarian regimes further illustrate the persistence of forced civilian labor as a tool of control. In the Soviet Union during the Stalinist purges and collectivization campaigns, peasants were compelled to perform grueling labor, including the exhumation and disposal of bodies from famine-related deaths, as part of broader efforts to maintain order and enforce ideological conformity. Civilians were coerced under the dual pressures of state surveillance and violent reprisal, highlighting how totalitarian regimes instrumentalize fear and administrative necessity to extract compliance from populations. While the ideological justification differed, rooted in political consolidation rather than racialized war aims, the psychological and moral pressures on civilians were comparable to those experienced in Nazi Germany. Japanese-occupied territories in Asia during World War II present another point of comparison. Civilians were routinely forced to engage in construction, sanitation, and labor associated with death and disease, including burying victims of air raids or epidemic outbreaks in cities and villages. Compliance was secured through threats, punishment, and, in some cases, executions. These examples demonstrate how wartime governments, facing collapse or operational pressure, mobilize civilian labor to manage immediate logistical and public health crises. In each instance, the tension between survival, coerced obedience, and ethical responsibility emerges as a central theme, underscoring the universality of the dilemma. Within Europe, the experience of occupied countries during World War II further highlights patterns of civilian coercion. In France, the Netherlands, and Poland, local populations were often compelled to participate in forced labor programs designed to support occupation authorities, including the management of public health crises and infrastructure repair after bombing or sabotage. Civilians navigating these circumstances encountered moral complexity similar to that of German citizens. Acts that were necessary for survival or public well-being often came at the cost of personal ethical compromise or exposure to extreme danger. These patterns illustrate a recurring dynamic in modern warfare, When state structures collapse or are repurposed for ideological aims, ordinary civilians become instruments of administration and survival, often at great personal cost. Historical comparisons also extend to non-European contexts. During the Rwandan genocide of 1994, local populations were sometimes coerced into disposing of bodies, clearing mass graves, or participating in tasks orchestrated by militia groups. The psychological and ethical pressures mirrored those in late-war Germany. Individuals confronted with pervasive violence and death were compelled to act under threat of reprisal, balancing personal survival against moral conscience. These instances underscore a universal aspect of coercion in contexts of mass death. The human response is conditioned by fear, necessity, and the capacity for both moral resistance and compliance. In addition to parallels in wartime contexts, forced civilian labor under totalitarian regimes offers insight into broader structural mechanisms. Governments facing crises, be they military, ideological, or epidemiological, frequently rely on coercion to mobilize populations for tasks that exceed the capacity of formal institutions. The Nazi regime's utilization of civilians to bury the dead exemplifies this pattern, combining pragmatic necessity with ideological enforcement. Comparisons with other regimes reveal that coercion is rarely purely administrative. It is intertwined with fear, moral negotiation, and social control, transforming ordinary citizens into agents of systemic objectives under duress. A crucial distinction in comparing cases is the interplay between ideological framing and practical necessity. In Nazi Germany, forced burial labor was simultaneously a response to logistical collapse and a demonstration of totalitarian authority, reinforcing both public health imperatives and the regime's control over civilian life. In other historical contexts, such as the Soviet Union or Japanese-occupied territories, ideological imperatives were similarly intertwined with practical labor needs, though the specific rationales, whether political, racial, or nationalistic, varied. These comparisons reveal how coercion functions both to achieve immediate administrative goals and to reinforce broader systems of power. The moral and psychological consequences of such labor are also consistent across cases. Civilians forced to engage with death, whether in Germany, Eastern Europe, Asia, or Africa, experience trauma, moral ambiguity, and long-term psychological distress. PTSD, survivor guilt, and social stigma emerge as recurring outcomes, reflecting the enduring human cost of coercion. While the cultural, temporal, and geographical contexts differ, the fundamental dynamics of fear, survival, and moral negotiation remain strikingly similar, highlighting universal patterns in human responses to extreme duress. Finally, comparative study underscores the importance of historical memory and documentation. Just as post-war historians have struggled to reconstruct civilian burial operations in Germany, other cases of forced labor under coercion are often underdocumented, marginalized, or subject to selective historical attention. Archival gaps, destroyed records, and survivor reticence create challenges for researchers, emphasizing the necessity of triangulating sources. Photographs, oral histories, official records, and forensic evidence, to reconstruct these episodes faithfully. Comparisons illuminate not only the recurring patterns of coercion, but also the broader challenges of preserving and interpreting histories of civilian suffering under duress. Through these historical parallels, the experiences of German civilians compelled to bury the dead emerge not as isolated horrors, but as part of a broader continuum of human response to extreme coercion. The intersection of administrative necessity, ideological enforcement, and moral complexity recurs across wars and regimes, revealing enduring patterns in the ways ordinary people are mobilized, constrained, and morally challenged. By situating these experiences within a global historical framework, historians can better understand both the specificities of late-war Germany and the universal dynamics of forced civilian labor under threat. As the dust of war settled over Germany, and the cities slowly emerged from the shadow of destruction, the human cost of the conflict became starkly visible. The civilians who had been compelled to bury the dead bore a weight that extended far beyond the immediate physical labor. They carried the invisible burden of trauma, moral compromise, and the constant negotiation between survival and conscience. The collapse of cities, the devastation wrought by bombings, and the omnipresence of death forced ordinary people into extraordinary circumstances. In examining this chapter of history, we confront not only the logistical and practical dimensions of wartime survival, but also the profound ethical, psychological, and social consequences that endure long after the guns fell silent. The experience of forced burial labor illuminates the intersection of horror and coercion in the late Third Reich. Civilians were thrust into the management of mass death under conditions of extreme duress, supervised by SS officers and local authorities, and operating in environments teeming with both visible and invisible threats. Decomposing corpses, collapsing buildings, and the ever-present risk of air raids created a daily reality in which physical survival required not only endurance but also compliance with morally taxing orders. The forced labor was a mechanism of control, a method for the regime to assert authority even as it faced imminent collapse, yet it simultaneously became a form of emergency public health intervention, illustrating the complex duality of necessity and coercion. Psychological trauma emerges as a central theme in this history. Exposure to death on a massive scale, combined with exhaustion, fear, and moral ambiguity, left indelible marks on survivors. Recollections of mass graves, the stench of decay, and the repetitive physical exertion are frequently accompanied in testimony by descriptions of guilt, shame, and ongoing moral conflict. These experiences reveal the long-term consequences of coercion, PTSD, social alienation, and moral questioning that often persisted for decades. The trauma was compounded by the dual role civilians played as both victims and unwilling agents of the regime, creating a moral tension that complicated post-war narratives of survival and culpability. The ethical dimensions of forced labor underscore the broader human questions posed by totalitarian systems. Civilians had to navigate between obedience and humanity, survival and conscience. Acts of quiet defiance, covering a corpse with a blanket, arranging bodies with care, or offering solace to fellow laborers, demonstrate that moral agency can persist even under extreme coercion. At the same time, the necessity of compliance, enforced through threat of death or punishment, illustrates the limits imposed by systemic terror. This tension highlights the profound moral complexity faced by individuals in wartime Germany, and by extension, in any context where civilians are compelled to act under duress. Historical documentation has been essential in reconstructing these experiences, combining photographs, municipal records, survivor testimonies, and forensic evidence to create a coherent narrative from fragmentary sources. The gaps in the record, whether due to destroyed documents or reluctance to recount trauma, remind us of the fragility of memory and the difficulty of preserving human experience amidst catastrophe. Survivor accounts bridge these gaps, offering insight into the lived realities of forced labor while revealing the psychological and ethical dimensions that official records often obscure. The meticulous work of historians in assembling these sources ensures that the experiences of civilians are not lost, even as the events themselves recede into the past. Comparisons to other historical instances of civilian coercion further contextualize the German experience. From forced labor on the Eastern Front in World War I to Stalinist exhumation campaigns in the Soviet Union, Japanese occupation policies in Asia, and modern genocides, patterns of fear, compliance, and moral negotiation recur across time and place. Civilians repeatedly find themselves navigating between survival, coercion, and conscience, often under threat of death or social reprisal. Recognizing these parallels situates the German experience within a broader human history, illustrating the recurring ethical dilemmas that arise under extreme duress and highlighting the universality of the challenges faced by civilians in wartime and under totalitarian regimes. The enduring lessons of this history are manifold. First, it reminds us of the devastating human consequences of unchecked power and ideological extremism. The coercion of ordinary citizens into acts they might otherwise have rejected illustrates the capacity of totalitarian regimes to manipulate fear, necessity, and authority to achieve compliance. Second, It highlights the resilience of human conscience even in the darkest circumstances. Civilians found ways, however small or fleeting, to assert dignity, compassion, and moral awareness, demonstrating that ethical reasoning persists even under severe constraint. Third, it underscores the importance of memory and documentation in preserving the stories of those who endured these experiences. Without survivor testimonies, photographs, and archival records, the human dimensions of forced burial operations might have remained obscured, leaving only the skeletal framework of logistical necessity. Equally important is the recognition that the horror of coercion extends beyond the immediate acts themselves. The physical, psychological, and moral tolls endured by civilians shaped post-war societies in profound ways. Survivors carried trauma into family life, community interactions, and societal reconstruction. The weight of guilt, shame, and moral ambiguity complicated post-war integration, shaping both personal identity and collective memory. In this sense, the legacy of forced burial labor is not confined to the past. It reverberates through subsequent generations, influencing how societies remember, interpret, and reconcile with their histories. Ultimately, the story of German civilians compelled to bury the dead is a somber reflection on the human capacity for endurance and moral negotiation amidst unspeakable horror. It forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the interplay between coercion, obedience, and ethical responsibility. Ordinary people, caught in extraordinary circumstances, bore burdens that were simultaneously physical, psychological, and moral. They acted under threat, yet maintained fragments of conscience. They labored amidst death, yet preserved fleeting acts of dignity. They survived, yet carried the weight of memory for decades. In contemplating this history, we are reminded of the broader implications for humanity. The conditions faced by civilians in late-war Germany under the fragility of moral and social structures under extreme pressure. They illuminate the ways in which power can manipulate necessity, fear, and compliance, and the extraordinary resilience required to navigate such conditions. The lessons extend beyond wartime Germany, offering insight into the enduring human struggles with authority, morality, and survival under coercion. As a historical record, the forced labor of German civilians to bury the dead stands as a testament to the complex realities of life under totalitarian regimes. It is a story of horror, survival, and moral complexity, one that challenges simple narratives of victimhood or culpability. It is a reminder that history is composed not only of grand military campaigns or ideological conflicts, but also of the small, agonizing decisions made by ordinary individuals navigating impossible circumstances. In the end, the weight of memory rests with the living. Survivors, historians, and society at large bear the responsibility of remembering those who endured forced burial labor, acknowledging both the trauma imposed by coercion and the courage of navigating such moral terrain. Their experiences compel reflection on the nature of power, obedience, and ethical resilience, and on the enduring human capacity to bear unimaginable burdens while preserving fragments of humanity. The story of these civilians is a stark, sobering reminder that the consequences of war extend far beyond the battlefield, touching the very core of human conscience, survival, and memory.